Good morning and welcome. I'm Bruce Weber, the Willem Coker Dean of the Zicklin School of Business here at Baruch College, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this episode of Zicklin Talks Business. Today's topic is income inequality increasing? If so, what can be done about it? I have joining me from the Dean's Office, Gwen Webb, Associate Dean for Executive Education, who will moderate the question and answer period at the end. We're delighted to welcome our panel today. First, Paul Krugman grew up in New York and graduated from John F. Kennedy High School in Belmore on Long Island. He studied economics as an undergrad at Yale University and earned his PhD at MIT in 1977. Paul returned to Yale as an assistant professor and then joined the faculty at MIT in 1979. He spent a year working in the Reagan White House as a staff member of the Council of Economic Advisors and rejoined MIT as a full professor in 1984. In 2000, Paul moved to Princeton University as professor of economics and international affairs. He retired from Princeton in 2015 and joined the faculty of the CUNY Graduate Center as a distinguished professor. Paul Krugman has written extensively on international trade, economic geography, and international finance. The Research Papers in Economics project ranks him among the world's most influential economists. He's been a New York Times opinion columnist since 2000. Dr. Krugman won the John Bates Clark Medal in 1991 and the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2008. The Nobel Committee recognized his contributions to the analysis of international trade patterns and the location of economic activity. His books, International Economics, Theory and Policy with Maurice Obstfeld and Economics with Robin Wells, are widely used textbooks. Uniquely, Economics includes a chapter titled The Economics of the Welfare State on Income Inequality. Joining Paul is Ted Joyce, professor of economics at Baruch College and the CUNY Graduate Center and a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research's program in health economics. He earned his bachelor's at the University of Massachusetts and his PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center in Economics, Labor, and Health in 1985. Ted's work on reproductive health policy has appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of the American Medical Association, Journal of Political Economy, and the Review of Economics and Statistics. Recent research of Ted's involves the evaluation of classroom formats on student performance at the undergraduate level. Ted's on the editorial board of the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. As always, our moderator is Larry Zicklin, former chairman of Neuberger Berman, an alum of the college, and the school's namesake. Larry also teaches in our undergraduate honors program. Larry, I look forward to gaining insights from today's discussion. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Larry.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I appreciate it. And welcome, everybody. Paul, I'd like to start with a question about whether or not there's an accepted definition of income inequality. Do economists agree on exactly what that is?
I mean, there are several definitions. I mean, you can, a lot of people use the Gini coefficient, which is, a little abstruse, and I don't like because it's hard to know exactly what it means. Other people use the share of the top X percent in income. Other people use the share, top 1%, top 10%. Other people use the ratio of incomes at the 90th percentile to the 10th percentile. The good news, it doesn't matter. They're all telling the same story.
What do you use? What is your
I tend to use all of them because it's always it's one of my old teachers used to say, people always want a number without a story, but it's actually, there's always a story, and then you use the numbers to buttress the story. But different data available for different time periods, different places. So I'll be using I think probably more often than not something like the 90-10 ratio, just because I know what that means. I know how to
10% of the people have 90% of the income.
No, it's the ratio of income at the 90th percentile of the income distribution to at the 10th percent, and that's that's pretty straightforward. You have a pretty sense. We kind of know who we're talking about. But the share of income going to the top 1% is fine. The Gini coefficient will tell you the same story. Yeah, I'll use that, and they all tell the same story, which is that American society got a lot more unequal. It got a lot less unequal in the sort of 1940s, and then became a lot more unequal starting around 1980, and continuing at least until fairly recently.
And is there a universal agreement that that's true? Or are there economists that would debate that?
There are a handful of economists who will debate it, but it's very hard. You really have to torture the numbers to make it not, to argue with it. And actually, there's really no question that market income, wages and dividends and all of that has become markedly more unequal. Then there's the question about exactly how much do government programs compensate for that, which is the only place. But and we can play with the numbers, and the numbers are pretty unambiguous. But above all, just look around, especially if you're of a certain age. If America in 2023 doesn't look more unequal to you than it did in 1973, you must not have been paying attention back then. This is just a very different society.
Well, I must admit that when I was a kid and growing up in the 40s and 50s, it didn't look unequal, but I came from a neighborhood where everybody was lower middle class, so I didn't see anything unequal. Everybody was equal. But if something happened in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, whenever, why did it happen and what happened?
Okay, now we can have now we have real arguments, right? And broadly speaking, there's the kind of invisible hand market forces, which a lot of that has emphasized or claimed that changing technology has increased the demand for highly educated workers and skill, versus the kind of social relations, power relations story that says that we lost some of the things that were checks and balances on high inequality, that the weakening of the union movement and changes in norms played a big role. Those don't have to be completely mutually exclusive, but one of the things that you notice if you're trying to do the market forces, skill stuff, is that a great deal of the increase in inequality has taken place within groups that have similar levels of skill. Roughly speaking, high school teachers and CEOs have similar levels of education and haven't exactly had the same income trajectory. And there's just not a lot of direct evidence that there really has been a skill bias for technology or that is driving it. And then there are things we know that are, we know that corporate CEOs were in the 60s were paid maybe 30 times as much as their average employee, and now more like 300. We know that unions were a quarter of the workforce into the 70s and are barely existent in the private sector now. But there is exactly how we got so much of a rise in inequality, and for that matter, how we became the middle class society we were for a couple of generations after World War II. Those are the subject of endless research.
So there have been CEOs for a very long time.
Yeah.
Why did they suddenly go from 30 times the average worker to 300 times the average worker? What happened?
Well, that's, one possibility, I guess, is that they got much better, which I don't believe for a minute, but that would be because what they might say. One possibility is that it became much more important to have the right guy as CEO, although that I also don't believe, but it's not logically impossible. The most likely thing I would say is that there used to be pretty strong, CEOs have always, there's always a pay committee that sets a CEO's salary. And the pay committee is always effectively appointed by the CEO. So why didn't they always make out like bandits? And the best arguments are that, first of all, you used to have powerful countervailing groups, especially unions, and that there was a kind of an outrage constraint. The CEO who just went and paid himself the kinds of salaries they now receive would be in trouble. And that you sort of just stop there. It's also true that we used to have much, much higher tax rates at the top. So was it worth offending and outraging a lot of people if Uncle Sam was going to take 85 or 90% of your additional income? And partly there's a kind of a norm. I mean, I've had people actually, I've been in rooms with business people who, been around for a while, and I actually had them seriously to say that it was Monday Night Football that did it. That what happened was that once they started televising football games, then the monetary rewards to winning teams went way up, and so quarterbacks started being paid enormous salaries. And since a lot of executives watch a lot of sports, they sort of looked at some guy who could throw a football and say, well, I'm pretty good at what I do. Why don't I get that kind of money? So, I mean, there was clearly a shift in norms. If in 1968, you had proposed paying what today's top executives get, you would have run, and you did actually occasionally. There was outrage over excessive CEO pay, and now nobody even mentions it.
I can't remember when it was determined that compensation over $1 million to chief executives would no longer be tax deductible. And so everybody got paid their compensation in stock options or grants, something like that. And I wonder if that didn't contribute to this.
Well, it certainly made it less visible. And and the stock options tend to be phony, right? It's an option that depends on the price of the stock, but the price of the stock goes down, they set the price of the option down along with it so that they get to make the money anyway. But it's a lot broader than that. CEOs are a significant part of this, but there's been a big increase in inequality. Some of us say that the rise in inequality is fractal. That is, you look at it at any scale and you find that there's been a growth in inequality within that subset. I mean, there's a big increase in inequality among dentists, and so there's some element of mystery to all of this, but it does kind of look as if we had it in the sort of during and in the aftermath of World War II, we kind of established some norms of relative fairness and equality in our society, and that those eventually just eroded. And people who could could extract extremely high incomes began to do so. And other things, the minimum wage, has consistently lagged behind inflation, so that people at the bottom are paid less and less. And unions, which used to be at their peak represented about a third of U.S. workers, and even if you weren't a union member, there was a kind of your company would pay wages sufficiently that there was no strong incentive to unionize. So when all of that went away, we evolved back towards the Gilded Age.
And by the way, the unions, which have been in demise for 40 years, 50 years, whatever the right number is, use that compensation between CEOs and workers very effectively in this last automobile negotiation, where I think it was the president of Ford Motor was pointed out and made some number of hundreds of times more than the average worker, and that was used in all kinds of advertising that I saw.
Yeah, and I mean, and we're seeing the union. We've had some visible union victories. It's not enough to really move the overall numbers, but there does seem to be something happening. I mean, there's clearly more labor activism, more support, and one of those things that I think almost nobody outside sort of people who study this regularly knows is that inequality, at least inequality in wages, has come down a lot in the last couple of years. So it's not as if inequality always rises. We're actually seeing a substantial compression, at least within salaried work, wage slaves. That 90-10 ratio that I'm talking about has reverted a significant way. It's still way higher than it was post-war, but it's significantly lower than it was just a few years ago. So with the question that the topic here is inequality increasing. I was wondering a little bit on what the meaning of the word is. It's inequality has clearly increased enormously over the past 40 years. It may have gone down in the past 3 years.
Or at least I've read that it's flattened out, certainly. And maybe
Well, it's actually, if you look at wages, it's actually quite amazing. Aaron Duby at UMass Amherst has this, what he calls the unexpected compression. There have been really startlingly large wage gains for the lowest paid workers in America in the last couple of years.
I think that has to do with COVID and the shortage of workers. And
well, COVID a little bit, and just full employment. Nobody will believe it, but we have an astonishingly full employment economy right now, and probably more closer to full employment than we've seen for a generation. And full employment turns out to be really good for the bargaining power of workers, especially workers at the bottom.
Where I've seen pressure to raise wages for CEOs, let's say, is on behalf of compensation advisory firms. What happens to us when you serve on a board is this compensation firm comes in and says, your CEO is in the 49th percentile, and you always think of him as somebody special. Why isn't that CEO in the 25th percentile or whatever, 20th percentile? And therefore we get this cat and mouse game where we're always jumping to reach the next highest level.
Yeah. So, it's human. That's kind of human nature. Every company is sort of obliged to think that their CEO is the best there is and to pay accordingly, and then everybody else tries to match. And the real question is, how is it that for 40 years after World War II, we managed to not be caught up in that kind of leapfrog? And it's impressive it's impressive it's impressive that it was held back so long, and then we're not yet really seeing a reversal of that. But who knows? The world has changed a lot more in this post-COVID era than I think we fully recognize.
And Ted, you're welcome to join us and ask questions at any point.
Sure. I just wanted to just share this quickly. Paul, so everything seemed to jumpstart with Piketty's publication of Capital in the 21st Century. And I know you commented on the book in various forums. Can you help us understand why this jumpstarted things so dramatically? And I'll stop sharing.
Okay. Let me say, first of all, it's a very good book, and Piketty is a really fine scholar, and his students are some of the best out there. And you have to imagine, I'm saying this because I'm going to be not negative on Thomas, but on the phenomenon there. It's not as if he was the first person to really notice that inequality has soared. Actually, a lot of the data that demonstrate is his previous work, but not in this book, which there was not that much new in this book. And there are lots of people devoted to it. And I sit at CUNY at the Graduate Center in the Stone Center for the Study of Socio-Economic Inequality, which is run, the people there have all been studying inequality for a long, long time, and been tracking this rise in inequality for a long time. So this is not something that is new. What Piketty did was he provided a kind of grand narrative with some controversial but interesting stuff, particularly arguing that capital, as opposed to high compensation, was going to play an increasing role in inequality, and that inherited wealth was going to play an increasing role, both of which are probably right. But there was also a strong element of somehow he caught the moment. It's a little bit like Stephen Hawking, right? I think to a first approximation, nobody actually ever read Stephen Hawking's book. But it was the book to have on your table to show that you were. And Piketty's book is better than that. I mean, not better than that. More people actually read it, but still, I think most people are, the message they took from it is inequality is high and has gone up a lot, which was true, but not something that was news to anybody else. But no, the real, I mean, I was writing about inequality. It was already obvious by the late 1980s that inequality was soaring. You could already had sufficient information to say, there's been some kind of inflection point, and somehow it's gone way up. And I wrote about it a bit back then, I wrote a paper now more than 30 years ago about all the ways in which people try to deny the obvious reality that inequality is rising. So this is not a new topic. This was something that we've known about, but it was kind of pushed into the background, or just people were saying it was all about education, which it has never been. And Thomas Piketty got the moment with a book that people felt they could cite. Anyway, the fact of rising inequality, again, we've really known since it was obvious already by data we had by like 1989. It's not new.
Has Piketty recognized what's happening in the last 3 years?
I don't know. I actually haven't seen him writing on this. He's actually not, he's not a very prolific writer. He does big books, and he's probably working on another one. I don't know that. But I mean, there's a whole community of people. So I mean, my go-to guy on wages now is Arindrajit Dubey at UMass Amherst, and he's been all over this. I mean, and so if you're paying attention to this stuff, you know that, wow, we've had, at least for the moment, things have really gone into reverse. And I should mention, by the way, that one of the real pioneers in this stuff was Claudia Goldin, who just won the Nobel for her work. A lot of what she got it for was for work on women's economics, but she also worked a lot on inequality in general over the years, always been much aware. And it was from her paper by her and Bob Margo that I learned how much of the middle-class society that I grew up in, the boomers middle-class society of the sort of 50s and 60s, did not evolve gradually. It was basically created in a 10-year stretch in the 40s. And so this is there's plenty of if you're following, again, how much of it is percolating through to the general public, I don't know. But people, again, there's a lot of people working on this stuff now, and we know that something has really changed, at least temporarily, in the United States.
Should we assume that if unemployment starts to rise again from this level, that we might see a reversal of this trend and we might see inequality increasing?
It's a pretty serious prospect. It's one of the reasons, there are many, but one of the important reasons for wanting to keep unemployment low is that low unemployment turns out to be especially good for lower income workers. And if a year ago there were a lot of people saying, "Oh, we have to have a big rise in unemployment to get inflation under control," but inflation's coming way down without the big rise in unemployment. So that's a reason to say, hey, doesn't seem to be any urgent reason why we can't try to keep this full employment economy. And that turns out to be not just good because you have more people working, but it turns out to be good because it's especially good for the worst off.
Did anybody imagine that we could go from inflation of what, 9-10% to 3-4 or whatever it is now, and have unemployment at this level?
Okay, so it's by the way, and the press does a terrible job on that. You really should not look at they always give you 1-year figures, and that's a tremendously, stale dated at this point. You want to look at something like 6 months, and we're basically at 2.5% now. We're very close to the official target of 2. And yeah, people imagined it. It was a possibility that was out there, particularly there was what we called team transitory, the people who thought that a lot of the inflation was just sort of temporary disruptions associated with the pandemic, which I was part of. But transitory turned out to be much, much longer than anyone expected. But the possibility that this thing would just unwind and come down was a minority view, but not that small a minority. And and history, it turned out way back at the beginning, White House economists said that the closest parallel to what we were going through was the aftermath of World War II, when there was a period of high inflation and a lot of disruptions as the economy normalized into a peacetime economy. And that looks exactly right. The data that we're seeing now look exactly like, almost to the decimal point, look like 1946, 47.
But Paul, you've written about this, and the feeling, if you listen to other surveys, whatever, that no one feels the economy is good as the numbers suggest. If you had told us that we'd be at 3.5% unemployment and 2% inflation, you'd go, that's unbelievable. And yet Biden's taken a huge hit because people at the gas pump or their eggs or whatever feel differently. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, we obsess about it a lot. I obsess about it a lot. And there's a lot of, again, there are competing explanations. One of them is that that people, to a certain extent, economists tend to look at 1-year inflation or 6-month inflation. People tend to compare. They tend to have a longer horizon. They go to this year's we have an unofficial source, but the estimate, a Thanksgiving dinner this year was 4.5% cheaper than it was last year, turns out. But it was about 25% more expensive than it was in 2019. So do people say, oh, look, the cost of a Thanksgiving dinner is going down? Or do people say, look how much it costs to have a Thanksgiving dinner? And there has to be a statute of limitations. People can't, no one's out there pining for 15-cent hamburgers. But so part of it is just that people were shocked by inflation and have not gotten over, despite the fact that the annual rate is down. People have not gotten over the fact that prices went up so much. That is part of it. And if that's true, actually, things may improve a bit. There's also this is, not my, but it's huge partisanship right now. If you look at we have some survey data that's broken down by self-identified party affiliation. If you look back at previous bad times, if you look at 1980, or you even look at the aftermath of the financial crisis, Republicans and Democrats had similar views of the state of the economy. As of right now, Democrats consider the economy to be better than it was on the eve of the pandemic, which is what I would say. It's about the same or a little bit better. Republicans rate it as being worse than 1980 when we had 12% inflation and 8% unemployment. So there's a lot of currents going in there, and I think one of the things we've just learned is that what people say if you ask people how's the economy doing, you're going to get an answer that's very much mediated by what they think they ought to say, as maybe mediated by what they see on their news source of choice. But if you ask people, how are you doing, which should be kind of related, but you get a very different answer. So we're now in a situation where people actually seem to feel relatively, there's obviously suffering, and we're a very unequal society, but that on average, people are feeling pretty good about their own situation. They're acting, consumer spending is really high. Airplane flights are full. People are acting as if they're doing financially pretty well. But when polled, they say that the economy is terrible. So they seem to think that really bad stuff is happening to somebody else.
So that sounds to me like it doesn't matter what the facts are. You can talk the economy down if you're inventive enough on social media or on the typical media.
Yeah, well, this is true of lots of stuff. I mean, it's true. I mean, it's been true. If you read me in the paper this morning, it's been true about crime for ages. I mean, we went through this epic decline in crime between around 1990 and just before the pandemic, and right through it, people kept on saying crime is increasing, just not where I live, and it's so this is it. It is politically, if you're a politician who went in for idealistic reasons, you probably believe that you will be rewarded if you deliver good results, and maybe not. What if what people see is what they expect to see, and it doesn't matter how well you actually do?
Let me ask you this. In your studies of income inequality, are you finding that it is much more difficult for a person born in a poor zip code to make it to the higher echelons than it was in the 40s and 50s?
Oh, this is not just my personal stuff. There's literature on that. Actually, one of our Stone Center faculty, Miles Korak, is a specialist on this. So it's a little, data get a little flaky as you go back. Social mobility in the United States has probably gone down, but what we really know is from the international comparisons that the United States, which is the most unequal of major advanced economies, also has the lowest social mobility. It's much harder.
How do you explain that? We used to pride ourselves on social mobility, and the three of us working for the City University obviously take pride in what our students do.
Right. No, in the City University, there's again, Raj Chetty has done some stuff. There are which university systems do actually cause a lot of upward social mobility, and the answer is basically the CUNY system and some of the California schools are completely off the charts. There's just nothing like what CUNY does, and I have an alarmingly elitist education, but both I and Janet Gornick, who runs the Stone Center, are CUNY babies. Her father went to CCNY and mine went to Brooklyn College. So CUNY system does this, but a lot of the rest of the system does not. But the big explanation about the US as a low social mobility country is probably, and this is what Miles Korak says, just that because our society is so unequal, the rungs of the ladder are especially far apart in America. It's just much, much harder to make that climb. Plus the fact that we have highly unequal basic education. The quality of basic education varies enormously from school district to school district, so that if you look at some Nordic countries, I mean, Finland famously has extremely good basic education for everybody, and also has extremely high social mobility because everybody ends up well educated. So So yeah, it is kind of funny. America is the myth, the American dream, and Horatio Alger and all of that. But the reality is that we are less that kind of society than basically anybody else in the advanced world.
Isn't this the kind of stuff that ultimately leads to social unrest?
Who knows? I mean, I have to say, the more I study, somebody else may know something that I don't. But what do we really understand about that? I mean, the Nordic countries are they're miraculously good at having relatively equal income, equal access to healthcare, equal access to education. They also have white nationalist movements that are relatively powerful. I mean, there's a strong anti-immigration wing in Denmark. Denmark is kind of if you're an American liberal, Denmark is a touchstone for what our society should look like, and an unattainable holy grail of decent social safety net. And yet there's a anti-immigration right in Denmark. There's the true Finns in Finland. So it's not clear. I mean, if there were any justice in the world, then yeah, this kind of inequality would feed a lot of social unrest. But it's not at all clear that there is any justice in the world.
Do you think any of this relates to the Magnificent Seven and the size of those, let's call it roughly a dozen companies rather than seven, and the enormous wealth that's being created at the top levels of those companies?
It might be, although that's probably a little. I mean, the rise in inequality really took off before that was happening. Before these particularly these big tech companies became so big. So it was already happening. Not clear, and it's also there. There's a tendency to assume that small companies are owned by small people, and in fact, there are a lot of individually quite wealthy people who own small companies. Many of them are fake. They're basically just tax things, but they're for real also. I mean, and if you want to ask who is particularly if you want to ask what's the profile of a really extremely dedicated Trump supporter in America, it would be kind of a personally wealthy owner of a small to medium-sized business who maybe probably doesn't have a postgraduate degree, might not even have a college degree. If you want to think of, and there are a lot of very rich. So of course, yes, the Musks and the Zuckerbergs and all of that are part of the story, but so are the local business people owning certain. Actually, if we think about why has inequality within the medical profession, which is one of those areas that has inequality of income among doctors has soared. An important part of that is that there's a lot of these, doctors partnerships that so you do surgery at the hospital, but you also refer patients to your offsite unit that does MRIs and tests and rakes in money for you personally.
Paul, I want to move you away just for a second. We've talked about income inequality. Is what you say about income inequality also true of wealth inequality, and perhaps to a greater degree?
Yes. Wealth is enormously more unequal than income, right? Lots of people in America have basically no wealth at all. And wealth inequality has always been much more unequal, but wealth inequality has skyrocketed, maybe even more than income inequality. And actually part of we started with Piketty. Part of what Piketty did, by the way, I've tried to get that, as I understand it, in terms of which syllable you accent, the answer is none. It's just sort of flat Piketty. But that the returns to wealth have gone up relative to the overall growth rate of the economy, so that wealth is self-perpetuating in a way that it wasn't for a long time, and maybe self-reinforcing, and inheritance becomes a bigger deal. And wealth matters, especially at the top. You don't get a good for most people. The only significant wealth they have is their home, if they own it. Financial assets are really very small for the most of the population. But at the top, if you want to know, how much money did Jeff Bezos make this year, that's really not an interesting question. It's all in the wealth now. So, and it matters. It particularly having a lot of wealth means that you're not subject to the vicissitudes of year-to-year fluctuations, whereas most people actually very much are, because they don't have that kind of cushion.
Larry, can I jump in here? No, sure. Paul, I'd be remiss if I didn't kind of show a lot of economists will contest the trends in income inequality. And this was from a recent publication. I don't know this area well, but this is from the National Tax Office and the Treasury Department, and it's showing you the fiscal income, and it has the various categories. But when it shows you here in the vertical axis here is the share of income to the top 1%. And then this is the timeline from 1960 to 2020. Yeah. And if you put transfer payments in and other kinds of EITC transfers or Medicaid transfers, et cetera, they're arguing that the share of income between the 1% and the rest has not been as great as this line up here, the fiscal income one, which actually includes capital gains. And so I don't want to take us into the weeds, because there are a lot of weeds in this whole debate here. One of them, which kind of shocked me, was the tax unit. In other words, if lower income folks are less likely to be married, and therefore their individual tax units, as opposed to college educated married couples who have been very stable and filed jointly, that's one tax unit versus this unmarried person who's a single tax unit. So it's complicated in that sense. So can you help us understand a little bit of how economists could come to such different conclusions in a graph like this, which is coming from the data of the Treasury Department?
Yeah. So actually, my colleagues, Janet Gornick and Branko Milanovic, are drafting a response as we speak. They say they're, among other things, not just the tax units, but apparently they're doing something weird with the definition of income in this study. And I haven't parsed it myself. But one thing I do know that does distort a lot of this stuff, it's a real question in a way, but transfers. So if you want to know what these measures mean, a lot depends upon government transfers. Transfers include healthcare.
Yes.
And so we have a lot of people on Medicaid has expanded enormously, and then we also have at this point now a significant number of people on the healthcare exchanges established by Obamacare. I'm almost sure, I haven't read this paper yet, but I've seen similar things. What they almost always do is they count Medicaid in the numbers and count it as its dollar value. And of course, the cost of healthcare has gone way up. So that makes it look like the US government is doing vastly more redistribution than it used to because of Medicaid. But at some level, I mean, is that right or is it wrong? It does not, whatever it does not get at the social sense of inequality. The fact that somebody who, if there's a homeless person or a person living in really substandard living conditions, but is also on Medicaid, and therefore is receiving several thousand, multiple thousands a year in federal aid, is that person not poor because of the value of the Medicaid? And that's at some level, I guess we're coming back to what is inequality, and ultimately, there's no right answer exactly in terms of the economics when you take into account things like Medicaid, and there certainly is no right answer about what is poverty. But I've always believed that it's ultimately a social construct. It's about, are you fully social inclusion? Do you have sufficient means to be part of the same society as more affluent people? That's a view with a very long pedigree, because it's in Adam Smith. It's in The Wealth of Nations, where he actually defines poverty. He actually tries to talk about what's necessary and what isn't, but it ends up being a definition of poverty. And he's saying in 1776 that you are above the threshold. You are not poor only if you can afford at least one good linen shirt and a pair of leather shoes. Because not that you can't live without those, but that you are an outcast from society in England in 1776 if you don't have a good linen shirt and leather shirt. That's a relative income. It's a social inclusion definition of poverty, and it's right there in Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations. And what I would say is that the measures like this one, I have to look at the details, but they're almost certainly saying, well, inequality hasn't gone up because we're spending more on healthcare. And that's, whatever you want to say about that, that's not the social reality. The social reality is that the gap in the sense that we're living in different material universes, depending upon which part of the income distribution we live in, that has clearly widened a lot, whatever numbers like this might say.
Paul,
Okay.
if you had your own way, would you raise taxes in the highest income groups, or would you change the inheritance state taxes, or enforce them to a greater degree?
All of that. We actually have a theory of optimal top tax rates, which is based upon the principle that extremely rich people, don't actually get very much satisfaction out of an additional dollar. So in effect, you should run your tax system so as to soak the very rich as much as possible. And we kind of know, we can estimate, and this is Joe Stiglitz and Emmanuel Saez, who's one of Piketty's students. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, it's Peter Diamond and Emmanuel Saez. Anyway, they estimated the optimal top tax rate is 73%. And some other estimates are a bit higher than that. And that's a pretty solid number. And of course, that's not what we have. So inheritance taxes, particularly, there's really no good reason not to tax inheritances pretty stiffly, extremely stiffly, as we used to. And even earned income. Now, if you want to compare, what we have a federal income tax, but we also, in New York, we also have a state tax, and we have a city tax. And you really should be including in this stuff sales taxes as well, so that the effective top tax rate on a New Yorker who lives on, a New York City resident who lives on earned income, as opposed to being like an equity manager. But actually, I always like to quote the movie Wall Street where Gordon Gekko ridicules being a 400,000 a year working stiff, right? But if you're a 400,000 a year working stiff in New York, you're probably paying on the marginal dollar you earn, you're paying a tax rate of between 50 and 55%. So 70% is not actually that outrageous a leap from where we are, but lots of the country does not pay that. Lots of rich people don't pay that. And I wouldn't worry about, and people are all worried about the incentive effects, given, you know, how high taxes are in New York. We all know how famously lazy and slow moving New Yorkers are, right? So I don't be all for that. I mean, I would say that we should have much higher taxes at the top end than we do, but that probably by itself is not enough to pay for all the programs I want. So
Gwen, I know you have questions from our audience.
okay.
There are questions. Let me interrupt, which I hate to do,
Yeah,
but
no.
we will anyway. There are a couple questions here. One is, and two of them are very closely related. One refers to the recent significant influx of migrants, and the question is, how does this affect the inequality situation? A very similar question came regarding the increase in women in the workforce over recent decades.
Okay, I mean, migrants tend to earn somewhat less than native born, so they'll tend to raise the inequality number, though it's not clear that that's something that you should think of as a problem, because the migrants themselves are doing much better than they were where they came from. There's a reason they came. And look, and most of I think a lot. I mean, I teach a course at CUNY at the Grad Center called Economics of the Welfare State, and and immigration is great for our ability to sustain social programs. Immigrants are generally relatively young, working age. They pay into the system. They won't collect benefits from our most expensive programs for many decades to come. So, you know, that's fine. Now, women, you know, by the way, that's already behind us, right? The big surge in women in the labor force was over by the 90s, and one of the things that people don't kind of realize, although Claudia Golden can tell you this, is that we think of America as being a leader in kind of gender inequality, but we're actually behind almost every other advanced country now in terms of women actually participating. We actually have a lower female labor force participation rate than Japan at this point.
Wow. Thank you. There's a question here that I'd like to refer to Ted, and that deals with you've talked about income inequality, wealth inequality, and Ted, you do a lot of work in the healthcare sphere. Do you see similar trends and comparisons in healthcare administration and delivery?
Let me go to another share. Let me come down here. This is by Raz Chetty, and he's done some of the most important work. And what they did here is they linked tax records to mortality rates and estimated life expectancy by income, which I thought was quite, you know, they had over 1.4 billion life years in this analysis. So it's a data analysis of huge import. But anyway, the orange line here is starting to age 40. What's the survival rate of somebody who's in the top 5% of the income distribution? And it's by age 63, it's clearly quite high. It's falling really rapidly among those who are in the bottom 5% of the income distribution. So just to speak, I mean, the inequality in income is clearly being mirrored right here in the inequality in health as well in terms of life expectancy. Now, the question is, you know, what produces health? That's a good question. So you've seen these inequalities in other countries that have national healthcare systems. So it's not necessarily healthcare per se that generates health. It's a very complicated kind of production function, so to speak, that produces health. But clearly it's correlated strongly with income. And I'm not sure if that addresses the question, Gwen, but we know that health is a multidimensional kind of outcome, and medical care is only one aspect of it. All right. So if you've got cancer, this is this United States is a good place to be. If your baby's born premature, the United States is a good place to be. For many other conditions, it's not a good place to be, especially by income inequality. So again, I'll stop there. It's a very complicated question, but maybe this is starting that conversation.
Can I just weigh in for a second? Because this happens to be one of my first of all, really, really important stuff. It's not and we've known this again for a while. It was not always thus. Life expectancy is much more correlated with income in America now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. It's just been a hugely widening gap. To the extent that we've had rising life expectancy, it's very much concentrated among higher income people. And that drives me crazy when people say we should raise the age of eligibility for Medicare and Social Security because life expectancy is up. Yeah, life expectancy is only up for the affluent. What you're saying is that janitors should be denied health care and not allowed to retire because lawyers are living longer. And it's an extraordinary thing. And although this association exists in other countries, it is much stronger in the United States.
Wow, thank you both. Bruce, there's a question here that really relates to you as Dean of the Zicklin School of Business. What can companies and business schools do to better facilitate social mobility for all of our students at Baruch? I'm sorry, is Bruce there?
Yeah, hey Gwen, sorry, I didn't see my video come on. But yeah, I think what business schools are attempting to do is create the social mobility ladder that Paul's referring to. And I think we do have students that are coming from zip codes that would not show up in the top 10% or the top 5% of income. And I think what a business school does for those students is gives them, access not just to the classroom learning, but maybe to some of the sort of tacit knowledge that we know is very important to rising up into, executive levels and starting a small business and being successful. So I look for a lot of the things we try to do in the business school to happen actually outside of the classroom. And I think that means things like professional life skills. But I'd be interested in Paul's reaction to that. What could a business school do to contribute to social mobility, Paul?
Boy, I don't have a good answer, I guess, but I would say the most important question would be whether students from disadvantaged backgrounds can get in, can afford the education, and then a lot of opportunities open up. And that's the CUNY difference. A big CUNY booster is that it does admit so many students from lower income backgrounds that at minimal tuition. And I think it's like 40% of the students in the system come from families with less than $20,000 a year. And onto business school. And so this is yeah, I mean the most important thing, I taught it previously. Princeton, if a poor kid gets into Princeton, probably he or she has a good chance of doing well, but there are hardly any such people. So
I just want to add something because Bruce and I have talked about this in recent days. What a business school can do is be very sensitive to where the opportunities are in business and make sure they're preparing students with that in mind. So we have to be on the cutting edge of what's going on in business society, and we have to be aware of what's being required of graduates, and we have to provide that education for them.
Larry, I think that's pretty much, we're out of time. I think we're going to have to end it here. Larry, Bruce, Paul, Ted, thank you all very much. As always, I wish we had more time, but thank you all so much.
okay,
thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you, Paul and Ted. Bruce.
Thanks, Gwen. Thanks, Larry.